one of our goals is to discuss the background and the evolution of Israeli foreign policy and get us right down to the present. Alan, you wrote a pretty wonderful article, maybe about 10 or 15 years ago on Israeli foreign policy. And you spoke about the ingredients in Israel's demographic and geographic DNA that contributed to Israel's conduct of foreign relations. How and to what degree have those changes occurred in Israel's foreign policy priorities over the last 75 years?
The question that I posed to myself was, here's Israel in 1948, newly independent, but surrounded by hostile states that are bent on its destruction. So what would one of the great strategists of history, Clausewitz or somebody else, advise a state in such a situation? And to what extent has Israel followed this? And I think the first thing would be to find support of a powerful state outside that area, a tie to a great power. Britain was perhaps a logical candidate, being the mandate power, but they had their own ties to the Arab world that kind of cut that possibility out. It was France in the mid-50s to the early 60s. Let's not forget France was the first important arms supplier to Israel at a critical time, and also instrumental in Israel's development of its nuclear weapons capability. But after 67, it's clearly been the development of ties with the U.S. that's been the key point here. The turning point being maybe the crisis in 1970, where Israel deterred Syria from invading Jordan. And it's very clear that there's an objective interest for the United States in this relationship as well. It's not just simply a matter of common democratic values. For the United States, a war between Israel and Arab states is always a disaster in economic terms, the impact on oil prices and so on, and other ways as well. A second element in a strategy of a state would be to reach out to the periphery. On the other side of these hostile Arab states are a number of other states that have their own disputes with the Arab world. In that classic Middle Eastern phrase, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So Israel reached out to Turkey. It was in deep conflict with Syria, so that added to it. Iran, under the Shah, before the current regime, was practically an ally. Ethiopia, a relationship that doesn't get much attention. Now, a third element would clearly be trying to reduce the conflict to its core, because the Arab states, especially those that don't border Israel, their interest in this conflict is not really an objective conflict of interest with Israel. It's their identity as Arabs. It's more ideological or cultural. And so a logical strategy in that case would be to actually reduce the intensity of the core conflict so that the more distant Arab states would feel free to detach themselves from it. And in this case, there's peace treaties with Egypt and Jordan, which have essentially detached themselves from the core conflict. And perhaps Israel, in terms of its own strategy, has not put all the weight that it might, because the improvement of the relations with Palestinians is not just something desirable in itself. It's also a key to ending Israel's overall isolation. Oslo was a period in which relations with the broader world outside the Muslim and Arab world, India, China, all these things really opened up. The last item is speak softly and carry a big stick. The big stick in this case being Israel's undeclared nuclear capability. The unacknowledged presence of these weapons has been of tremendous importance in the overall ending of Israel's isolation, the kind of tacit acceptance by major Arab states.
Eran, how would you like to amplify what Alan has spoken about?
Israel's first foreign policy and grand national strategy is dedicated to achieving and attaining the means of survival in what has been a hostile environment and may yet become again a hostile environment if Iran gets to dominate the region with an exterminatory agenda. The first arms suppliers to the young state of Israel were actually the Soviets through the Czechoslovak connection. Stalin had his own reasons to do it. And it was tempting for Israel, as it was then socialist, with many people with deep sympathies historically with Russia, to go that way. We owe it to David Ben-Gurion that he made a very clear decision the night of June 30th, 1950, when he ordered the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Sharet, to go with the Americans at the UN on the Korean invasion. He made the choice that Israel belongs in the camp of democracies. And that angered Stalin to the point of genocidal wrath. He was willing to do away with these perfidious Jews. Luckily, he died in 1953. But Ben-Gurion made a decision, and that decision was right away connected with Israel's standing in America and Israel's link to American Jewry. But it's true, France was our friend, supplier, ally, a bridge over the Mediterranean, but it was all, as they say in good Talmudic language, talui b'davar. It was dependent on a thing. The thing was the Algerian War. As long as Nasser and Arab nationalism were the enemies of France, Israel was a friend, and an important friend. And hence the collaboration, the Sinai conspiracy, which the Brits reluctantly joined. But this did not survive Algerian independence, November 1962, and the French begin to fade away. And in 1967, it's, of course, a very ugly divorce, which left Israelis bitter about the French to this day. There is a sense of French perfidy that has not left us entirely. But luckily, already the foundations have been laid in the early 60s, even before 1967, for the American connection, which holds. And the reason it holds is that it stands on three powerful legs, not one thread of common interest, but what I call the VIP triangle: values, interests, and politics. The capacity of Israel's friends to have an influence in Washington, the capacity of Israel and the United States to have common interests, whether it was in the Cold War or later in the global war on terrorism, or today as we look at the realignment of the world along some kind of division between the free world and the not so free world. Israel has made a choice, a strategic choice, and it adheres to this choice. I was listening very carefully to Prime Minister Netanyahu's speech for the 4th of July, and everything he said there was for the ears of those who thought he was toying with some Chinese idea. He's not toying with Chinese ideas. There is no Chinese idea. There's some business with China. There's some conversations to be had with China, particularly on Iran, but China is not an alternative. America is our choice. In military matters, for example, the level of cooperation is unprecedented because today Israel is the most important country in the CENTCOM area of responsibility. Israeli foreign policy did spread to the periphery, as Alan said, very much as a way for Ben-Gurion to persuade the Americans that Israel is a valuable asset. And today we have the reversal of that strategy. We are now in conflict with Iran, a complex relationship with Turkey, and instead we are bringing together the core of the Eastern Mediterranean, Israel, Greece, Cyprus, and Egypt, with a commonality of interest that ranges from gas and economics to the strategic level. With the broader world, we had a love affair with Asia and Africa. Ben-Gurion studied Buddhism in Burma, and Golda Meir danced with African tribesmen, and we thought we were going to be a leading light to the developing world. By the way, this also was a wink to the Americans, who saw Israel as an alternative model of development for these countries than the one the Soviets were offering. But all of this, as Alan said, came to a halt in 1973, and we had long and painful 18 years in which Israel was truly isolated, in which Zionism was castigated at the UN as a form of racism and so on. But this all changes not after Oslo. The change came at Madrid, when we came to talk to the Arab world under American and dying Soviet guidance, and it became a very impressive turning point insofar as Russia, India, and China all resumed in the case of Russia, established in the case of India and China, relations with Israel. Of these three, the strategic relationship emerging now is with India. This is a relationship that's growing in leaps and bounds in terms of trade, which is very significant militarily for India and very significant economically and in terms of economies of scale for our defense industries. We used to think about foreign policy strictly as an adjunct to our national security concerns writ large. Today, and this is one of the reasons the focal point of policy has shifted from the Tel Aviv area, the security triangle of the Mossad and the military and the other security agencies, to Jerusalem, where the foreign ministry sits not far from the Ministry of the Economy. And Israel is today a major trading country. We are running a trade surplus quite often. I think Pinchas Sapir died without ever seeing a single year in which Israel was at a surplus. Now we are exporting to the world $160 billion a year. We have very large dollar reserves. We have become key players in the fields that will dominate the future: cyber, artificial intelligence and its economic derivatives, even esoteric stuff like alternatives to meat. And today, even in Europe, which used to be referred to in my time at the National Security Council as the lost continent, we have friends. We have a significant array of friends. We still have the Irish and the Swedish and the others. Belgians are automatically anti-Israeli. But we have the Hellenic element in alignment with us. We have Eastern European countries who are deeply committed to friendship with Israel. We have a nation like Germany, with all the historical background, which is now buying the Arrow 3 from the Israeli defense industries. We have a changing landscape, and it very much now remains for us to behave in a manner that enables us to realize our potential rather than waste it.
Aviv, could you tell us a little bit about MASHAV? Tell us a little about what you're now doing and why this is so terribly important in Israel's foreign affairs?
We at MASHAV have actually tried to look at how do we take those marching orders from our founding fathers and mothers and translate them to a practical translation on the ground that from one hand will yield results and dividends for Israel's interest, but on the other hand will also lie within the essence of what Israel is about in terms of our Jewish values and in terms of our goals. So today, I'm going to actually, I think, maybe tell you one of the biggest secrets of the state of Israel. When we talked with any foreign minister and we briefed him about MASHAV, his jaw falls down and he says, we actually deserve the prize of Israel for the fact that we have kept the secret so long. We have an agency which is focused on foreign aid, international development abroad. The name of the agency is MASHAV. It's an acronym for International Cooperation. This is a very strong brand in the world of development. And Israel's Agency for International Development Cooperation, MASHAV, has been there since 1958. This is 65 years that we are celebrating today, with the first goal, as you see here on this slide, to empower individuals, communities in need by sharing exactly those technologies, know-how, experiences, and expertise that we have, and in a sense, to be connected to the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals agenda of the UN of 2030. The founding mother of this agency, Golda Meir, talked about the fact that Israel needs to push forward all the models that we know, especially beginning with Africa. And what's really amazing is that it was established in 1958. Obviously, we're not in the scope of USAID, but all of these sister agencies like the USAID, GIZ, the Germans, the DANIDA Danes, JICA, the Japanese, etc., they were all agencies of developing countries. In 58, Israel was still a developing country, which is really fascinating to understand the vision of where we wanted to go. And if you see the quotes from Herzl, Ben-Gurion, and Golda Meir, you see that the idea was not only to actually do it for our interest, but also for the value traditions of Tikkun Olam. We're connected, as I said, to the 23 UN global agenda of the SDGs. There are 17 of them. Israel has picked out of the 17 8 themes, and these are the priority sector that you see in front of you, from food tech, ag tech, education, public health, gender equality. We were actually working on topics like gender equality and women empowerment in the early 60s, which is really mind-boggling. Innovation and entrepreneurship is, of course, a new topic, and R&D and humanitarian assistance. We've been working vis-a-vis a mechanism which we call capacity building. We are not strong in building infrastructure around the world, but rather invite representatives of countries to come to Israel, and we focus on the concept of train the trainers. We work in 140 countries around the world, 99% of them in the developing world. We do have one angle that we have done in the States, in Chicago, but the rest of them are 140 countries around the world where we have brought, since 1958, about 350,000, I'm mentioning that number again, 350,000 trainers, not the end user of a farm, but rather a manager that later on can use what he's seen in the course in Israel, in the training centers of ours, and go back to his own country and amplify it and return it again in terms of an ROI. We have 3 training centers here in Israel. We also have consultants abroad. We have short-term consultancy, long-term consultancies. We have consultants that stay for years abroad. The full cycle of life is the fact that these trainees take the knowledge, they go to their countries, and then they're encouraged to come up with ideas and projects that will be implementing what they've seen back in their homeland. Just for example, this year, in the terms of long-term and large projects, we have built 2 ICUs, intensive care units, in countries that people would not believe that Israelis are active, Chad and South Sudan. We have established hospitals in locations that they really don't have even a basic hospital there. A mid-size project could be centers of excellence. We have 30 of them in India. We have established a few in Guatemala just recently this year. And small-scale kind of project. I'm very proud of the last project that I just authorized. We're working very strongly on concept of education that came from Israel. So we have worked on early childhood education, special needs. We just initiated a project in Azerbaijan with children with special needs, and we established a sensory lab for children with autism. And of course, the humanitarian aid angle, you maybe have heard about our recent involvement with Ukraine, especially with the only civilian field hospital that was deployed inside Ukraine. We had about 7,000 patients that were taken care of, and we're very proud of that. So between the courses in Israel and the courses on the spot in the countries themselves, delegations and the projects, we work both bilaterally with the countries themselves. We work trilaterally with sister agencies and multilaterally with UN agencies. And of course, you can understand the yield dividends, including the political one, foreign policy dividends, branding dividends, economic and commercial dividends, but also, of course, the dividends in the values of promoting Tikkun Olam and making the world a better place. I just sat down recently with a visit of the CBC, the Congressional Black Caucus. And when I elaborated about our work in Africa, including examples of what we did in Ethiopia in building the total export industry of avocados from Ethiopia to Europe is based on Israeli technologies. And if I tell my friends from the Latin Caucus about what we are doing in Latin America, and if I mention these stories to both governors and state legislators, it's really shocking for them to really understand. Now, as a diplomat, I would say that 90% of the Israeli diplomats are focused on the conflict agenda, whereas 90% of the diplomats of the world are focused on the global agenda, on the SDGs that I mentioned. So we, in order for A, being more relevant to the global agenda, B, sharing what we have, and C, yielding more dividends, as I mentioned, foreign policy dividends, economic dividends, branding dividends, and values dividends, we need to invest more time, more effort, more budget in connecting ourselves to the global agenda's SDGs, because I believe that the ROI for Israel is much more than a dollar for dollar. The ROI is significantly higher than any other spaces that we are focused on. At the end of the day, when we take these marching orders from our ministers, which is basically very general, maybe fortifying Jewish and democratic state of Israel, promoting peace and preventing war, each diplomat at the end of the day takes it and needs to translate it to operational manner. And when I was in Washington, I was very proud to be involved in the Missile Defense architecture that was built at the time vis-a-vis the US Congress before anybody heard even the word Iron Dome. We had to go to a chairman of the Appropriations Defense Subcommittee to introduce a concept of a missile hitting a missile outside of the atmosphere. We didn't believe it would work, but it worked. These are the partnerships that you're looking to build and to translate these core elements that both Alan and Eran were talking about. Our diplomats are trying to make A, Israel safer, B, making this world a better place, and C, if we can do it while promoting peace and preventing war, it's even better.
Israel's foreign policies have evolved between ideologies and interests. As historians of Israeli foreign policy and practitioners, how have Israel's idiosyncrasies changed in the span of 75 years? How much should Israel's foreign policy allow external parties to play a role in Israel's internal politics? There is an appeal on the part of Israelis seeking foreigners to engage or even intrude in Israel's domestic politics. Is that healthy for the state of Israel?
It's not healthy, but it's nearly inevitable, because the one relationship that really matters, the Israeli-American relationship, is a relationship within the family. It has all the characteristics of a relationship within the family, including family quarrels at the Pesach dinner. Aviv mentioned tikkun olam. I used to joke that this is an American term that has no proper translation in Hebrew. The way Americans use it is very different from how Israelis understand it. We are an argumentative people. We have been since our inception. And we draw these arguments out into our family overseas. And our family overseas goes to the administration and says, look, the Israelis are asking us to put a finger in it. I don't think, frankly, that the Reagan administration would have moved forward with ideas about negotiations with the Palestinians, or that the Clinton administration would have invested such an immense amount of time and attention to this one corner of the world, or that the Biden administration would be now busily trying to tell Israel what to do in matters of judicial reform, if it wasn't for their own interactions with an American Jewish community, which was very worried about the Intifada of 1987 and very hopeful about the possibilities of peace in the 90s, and now sick to their stomach about internal Israeli divisions in 2023. Which brings me to the key question of Israel's idiosyncrasies. This is changing, in the sense that Israeli society today is probably about half the Jewish people. It is not the poor cousin anymore. The GDP per capita of Israel has gone above that of Germany. We've gone over that of Japan a few years ago. We are now not what we were, dirt poor socialist society clinging on. We are a different nation now. We are also a multicolored nation in a very different way. Our tribal structure colors the way we look at foreign policy in some ways, because there are significant segments within Israeli society which do not share the perspectives about the world that the founding fathers had. The ultra-Orthodox don't look at things that way. The radical right-wing nationalist religious segment does not look at the American connection the way we were raised to think about it. A sense of don't tell us what to do, and we basically at the end of the day can do without you, is coming into the conversation in ways which I find worrying and troubling, but for some people, this is an assertion of national pride.
These contretemps that happen recently, they're nothing new. This has been almost from the beginning of the relationship. I remember actually one time an open conflict between the two countries, and somebody asked Moshe Dayan, wouldn't Israel eventually have to do what the United States wanted it to do? And the answer was, yeah, when they land the Marines on the beaches at Haifa, then we'll have to take it. Nothing new. And in a sense, a good, close relationship is going to have this element in it. I would just add also that this has been an asset to both countries. I mean, countries sometimes would see improvement in relations with Israel as a way of getting closer to the United States, or they see getting closer to the United States, particularly if they want the U.S. to put pressure on Israel, then this is a good motive for them to try to work through Washington and improve their relationship there. I don't see Israel's interests so much changing over time if you define these in the general terms of survival in a hostile environment and so on. What's really changed is the circumstances. And here I would like to add a strong voice of support for what Eran said about the changing strategic situation today, where you have Iran as the major threat in the area, not just to Israel, but of course to most of its neighboring states and to moderate Arab states throughout the region. This is part of the broader threat of radical Islam. And that has certainly created a new situation with many openings for Israel. This is a long-term thing. It's not new. In some ways, the detachment of Arab states from the conflict began soon after 1967. We had the peace treaty with Egypt already at the end of the 1970s. The changing and strategic environment has meant that it's a new world, and the nuclear ambitions of Iran here are a threat to all of its neighbors. I have had reports get back to me of Israeli diplomats who are quietly meeting with for years, not just recently, with diplomats of the Gulf countries. And they're saying, well, when are you going to attack nuclear facilities? They would be the first to condemn it publicly, but they certainly would like to see Israel act on this regard. And other sorts of interests. Years ago, I was on a ship that docked in Dubai and got off into the world's biggest shopping mall in Dubai. In the middle of the aisle, there was a kiosk which was selling Ahava products from Israel. Now, it wasn't emblazoned on the side with the big word Israel, but I could recognize the accent of the young man who was selling these products. When I had a chance, I addressed him in Hebrew, and he immediately shut me up because it wasn't yet to be publicly known. But these kinds of connections have been building quietly behind the scenes all these years, and it does express the changing circumstances which have really created a new constellation.
Aviv, how have you seen Americans react differently to Israel from, let's say, when you first started in the foreign ministry?
It was described here as kind of a family relations, right? I don't think it's an uncle's relations or siblings relations. Maybe it's a spouse relations when one side is is more dominant and the other side is nodding, yes, ma'am. Look, it's pretty clear that Israel of the 70s is not the current Israel or the Israel in the last 2 decades. Israel has evolved, has developed, and is capable of supporting itself by itself, which is the goal of what we want to do in the long run, to be able to defend ourselves by ourselves. But it's also clear that without the US support, whether on the multilateral arena, especially in the Security Council, but also in other spectrums around the relationship, without the US-Israel special relations and the support coming from the United States towards Israel, Israel would not have been where it is at the moment. There were a few voices, without mentioning names, including ministers that have looked to the sides to see if there are other certain powers that are raising around the world. I think there's no substitute to the relations that Israel has with the United States. But having said that, whereas in the first decades, the support was overwhelming in terms of financials, etc. Today, there is a continuous support, but there's a change of colors of it. At the beginning years, the foreign aid towards Israel consisted of two elements. One is the FMF, the foreign military financing, meaning the foreign military support. And then the other was the ESF, the economic support. The economic support at the time of the first Netanyahu government was eliminated due to the fact that Israel was already a country that is able economically to stand by itself. The foreign aid has changed to only a military support, with 75% of it in the shape of coupons of US military products and 25% of it with an actual check. And recently, the direction is to go all foreign aid support just in the shape, I would say, in certain coupons of US products that are produced in the States, but supported to Israel. And by that, you, of course, have a double win situation. But you asked also where I envision the future cooperation. So if we see a movement from ESF to FMF to certain fractions of full support to 100% coupons, I think the future, if you look at it, is towards cooperative programs. And I think the model is the Missile Defense Cooperation, where Israel and the United States have invested, I don't want to say $1 to dollar, but in terms of the know-how, the experience, and the capabilities that we brought to the table, and the support coming from the United States has yielded great interest also to the American side. For many years, the MDA, the Missile Defense Agency of the United States, has been working on creating this missile defense architecture. They have invested about $10 billion each year. And I have to tell you that only when Israel joined the effort with the MDA and with IMDO, the Israel Missile Defense Organization, and together they have invested time. That's the only time when the results really came in, almost 90 to 95% of the interception rate. So I think the way that we should take it forward is that Israel is not there on a needy basis, but rather more of a partner. How do we find these cooperative programs where Israel is also bringing to the table added value to the United States? One last element on the foreign policy angle. For many years, I think the best example to see where we needed also the Americans is that even with all our peace accords, both with Egypt and with Jordan, and of course recently with the Gulf states, with the Abraham Accords, there was always a need for alignment of stars of an Israeli leader that is willing and capable to deliver the commitment. And I think we always had that, but we were always lacking the other side, the leader. In case of Egypt, it was Sadat. In case of Jordan, it was Hussein, that are not only willing to make that courageous move, but also capable of delivering it. But then the third element was always the fact that the signing accord was in the White House with the US president. So the triangle with the Egyptians was Carter. And with the Jordanians, it was Clinton. And with the Gulf state, it was Trump. And I think that is a very, very significant message. With the last point to think about is that there's always room for innovation in this foreign policy concept. Nobody has ever believed that the Gulf states will move forward before the Palestinians. So there's room for innovations, there's room for creativity, and there's room for optimism. Today we have many of these countries, both on our borders, but also in the second tier and in the third tier that are willing to cooperate. So there's room for optimism, but there's also very much room for cautious and continuous making sure that we're there.
What one piece of advice would you like to offer to the Israeli foreign minister or to the Israeli prime minister?
Get back to the core issue. The key to improving relations with Saudi Arabia, the way to move that forward most effectively would be to restart negotiations with the Palestinians. There have now not been any serious negotiations on core issues of this conflict since 2014. I know that the obstacles are probably not any easier, maybe even more difficult than they were at that time, but it would be good to see some efforts being made in that regard.
With all due respect to the Palestinian issue, it's not amenable to a permanent status agreement. A permanent status agreement is simply not in the cards given who we deal with. Abbas has some fine points, but the man is 87 and is not going to make any major decisions soon, and neither is Netanyahu on that question. And our focus and our survival, ours and many others worldwide, depends on stopping Iran's nuclear program. And that depends on our own willingness, ability to act. There are only two other countries that can turn Iran away. One is the United States using its stick, and the other could be the Chinese with carrots. One as an adversary, the other as a friend. This is the primary conversation that we now need to have.
I think that the priorities are pretty straight for us. Preventing war is the first and foremost, and making sure that Israel is safe as a democratic and Jewish state. And I think that is connected to both what my two esteemed colleagues have mentioned. In terms of priorities, no doubt that we are extremely worried about where Iran is heading. And we will do anything that we are capable to do, both in foreign policy means and other means. With the other topics of moving forward, especially Saudi Arabia, as I mentioned, the days with the Presidents Carter, Clinton, and Trump, we all know that when it comes to Saudi Arabia, President Biden, hopefully, God willing, inshallah, will play a major role on that. And hopefully we'll be able to move forward on that.